Okay, last time I talked about a wide variety of implicit perception effects, beginning with classic subliminal perception paradigms, going through masked priming and inattention paradigms, and ending with an interesting variant known as subliminal affective priming, studied mostly by Tony Greenwald and his colleagues. And here we're looking at semantic priming. The priming is based on the meaning of the word, but it's not based on the denotative dictionary meaning of the word. It's based on the connotative or emotional the valence of the word. And I showed you this experiment before, where you can actually get affective priming when the prime is unmasked. That's conscious priming. But you can also get the affective priming when the prime is masked. That's unconscious priming, or evidence of implicit perception. I skipped over this one last time, but let me just point out for those of you who are interested, here we've got the extent of priming on the vertical axis and detection of the prime on the horizontal axis. And what you can see here, beautiful, extensive psychophysical study by Greenwald and his colleagues, even when prime detection is at 0 levels, absolutely no detection of the prime at all, you're still getting a significant priming effect. But there are tricks. I showed you these slides before. I'm building up to something here. If the prime has to last for at least a little bit of time, here they've inserted the mask only 17 milliseconds after the presentation of the prime, and you don't really get any priming effects. So that the prime has to be on long enough so that you can do some processing with it. Moreover, these priming effects don't last very long. Here we've got the duration in milliseconds between the presentation of the prime, the masked prime, and the presentation of the target. And what you see here is that the magnitude of the priming effect falls off very rapidly. So there are limitations to this subliminal priming effect. It's not the case that you can prime somebody unconsciously and then they go off and they behave in accordance with that prime forever or whatever. There's another limitation of these effects that I think is quite interesting. This is also work by Tony Greenwald, in which he tried to look at the extent or the limitations of subliminal affective priming in another way. In each of the experiments that I've talked about so far, the prime consisted of a single word, a word like enemy that has a positive or a negative valence, and then a target like wins or loses that has a positive or negative valence. And what we saw was that the subliminal presentation of a single affectively toned word can prime the affective processing of a single word thereafter. In this experiment, which is one of those experiments, when you get into this field enough, you start carrying around in your head a kind of Faustian list of experiments you'd sell your soul to have done. And this is on my list. I just love this experiment because what Greenwald did was to create two-word primes that changed their affective tone. So you can see how this happens. If you take two positive words like hero wins, well, that's a good thing, okay? Heroes winning, right? If you take a phrase like enemy wins, which consists of a negative word, enemy, paired with a positive word, winning, that's also a negative thing. Hero loses, that is a positive word paired with a negative word, and that's a negative thing. But the nice thing about this one is enemy loses is a pairing of two negative words, negatively toned words, that has positive affective connotations. It's a good thing when enemies lose, okay? So now, the purpose of this particular experiment was to determine whether the subliminal, the masked presentation of a two-word prime like enemy loses would facilitate processing of a target. But of course, if we're talking about affective priming here, a two-word phrase like enemy loses, which has negative affective meaning, should facilitate the processing of targets that also have negative affective meaning. There's an affective congruity effect here. And the finding is that it doesn't, okay? When the here's the pairing of the negative and the negative. Enemy loses. And what you see here is that there's just no priming effect there whatsoever. This experiment's a very, very clever experiment, and it's interesting because it reveals an important further limitation on the extent of masked priming. We've already seen that the prime has to be presented for enough time to permit it to be processed at all. We've already seen that the priming effects don't last too long, so that the target has to be presented pretty close in time to the target. But now what we see in this experiment is that you may be able to analyze the affective meaning, the connotative meaning of a single word under conditions of mass presentation, but you don't have enough cognitive capacity to analyze the affective connotations of a two-word phrase, okay? So even something like drink Coke is not likely to have any effect on people. These are very, very, very limited kinds of effects. So, why are you doing this to me? Okay, so there's just a review of the limitations on so-called subliminal perception as it's revealed in the masked priming kind of paradigm. The effects are weak, okay? These are not powerful effects that affect everybody who's presented with them. And more important, the effects are time limited. The prime has to be presented for sufficient time to allow it to be analyzed, okay? The interval over which the priming effect is supposed to occur, that doesn't last too long. And semantic processing is possible, but the semantic processing is analytically limited. Okay, so just to review the bidding for a second, we've seen a whole bunch of different paradigms in which so-called unconscious perception takes place, where you can see the influence of a stimulus, like a priming stimulus, on the subject's experience, thought, or action in the absence of conscious awareness of that priming stimulus, in the absence of conscious perception. And there are lots and lots and lots of different ways in which you can see this, all of which are, so far as we know, analytically limited. They don't last too long, and you can't do too much with it, but they're there anyway. Okay, we've talked about implicit memory. We've talked about implicit perception, spent a long time on both of those. I just want to point out that this implicit-explicit distinction can be extended to other domains as well. First, just to kind of get things clear, let's look at the relationship between implicit memory and implicit perception. In implicit memory, you have the influence of a past event on the person's experience, thought, or action in the absence of conscious recollection of that past event. In implicit perception, you have the effect of a current event on the person's conscious experience, thought, or action in the absence of conscious perception of that event. But now let's look at other kinds of cognitive domains like implicit thought, where you've got the influence of some kind of idea on the person's behavior in the absence of conscious awareness of that idea. And I don't have time to talk about that material today. If you're really, really, really interested in it, it won't be on the exam because I'm not lecturing on it, but there's lots of detail in the lecture supplements. But in principle, you ought to be able to find evidence of the influence of unconscious thoughts. And it turns out, if you do the right kind of experiment, you can see that as well, where you can tell that the person, some idea is passing through the person's mind because you can see the effect of that idea on his or her behavior, even though they're not, as far as we can tell, consciously aware of that idea. Okay. What's interesting about this implicit thought business is that it seems to play a role in problem solving of various kinds. When we try to solve a problem, you're presented with a math problem or a physics problem or a chemistry problem on the board, and then you try to solve it, one of the things that often happens is that you have some kind of intuition that the problem can be solved, even though you don't know what the solution is. okay? And other kinds of problems, you can say, you can't solve that, okay? Mathematicians have this experience all the time when you present them with various kinds of problems. They say, that's just insoluble. And then you say, why? And they'll go work it out for you. But it's very clear that they haven't worked it out already. They just kind of know intuitively that the problem can be solved or not. One interesting model for problem solving in general says that when you're presented with a problem, if you know the solution or you can work out the solution quickly, that's what you do. But otherwise, what often happens is you go into a period of incubation where you appear to be working on the problem unconsciously, okay? And over this incubation period, at some point, you start getting warmer and warmer and warmer. You'll give me that metaphor. And then pretty soon you say, I think I can figure this one out. I think this problem is soluble. That is what's known as the intuition phase of problem solving. And then you work on it a little bit more consciously, and then you get to the insight. So these intuitions seem to play an important role in the unconscious phase of very complex problem solving, and this is a phenomenon that psychologists studying problem solving have begun to take seriously. Okay. The other cognitive domain in which this explicit-implicit distinction that comes up is in the case of learning. And again, this won't be on the exam. There's a lot of material on it in the lecture supplements if you're interested. But it turns out that you can acquire new knowledge and use that knowledge in various kinds of problem solving without having conscious access to what the thing is that you've learned. Okay? Again, it's a kind of implicit or unconscious knowledge that seems to support intuitive kinds of judgments. And there are, again, lots of examples of that as well. Just to make it clear what's going on, there are lots of domains in which you can see it. This is all in the lecture supplements. But the important thing is to look at the relationship between implicit learning on the one hand and implicit memory on the other hand. Implicit memory is always unconscious episodic memory. Implicit memory is memory for an episode that occurred in the past, like the presentation of a prime. Implicit learning doesn't refer to episodic memory. It refers to what we call semantic memory or procedural knowledge. It refers to generic, abstract knowledge about the meanings of words and how to tie a half-Windsor knot in your necktie, or for that matter, how to tie your shoes. It turns out we can acquire new semantic and procedural knowledge and use that knowledge in ongoing task performance, even though we don't seem to be aware of what that knowledge is. Now, I'm skipping over implicit thought and implicit learning because there are demonstrations of this in the literature, but implicit thought and implicit learning are not nearly as well established as implicit memory and implicit perception are. They're still quite controversial. The experiments are interesting, but there are a bunch of interpretive difficulties associated with these experiments. Okay. Implicit memory, implicit perception, implicit thought, implicit learning constitute what a number of us have come to call the cognitive